Okay, so I got a few questions after posting the one video with the Photon about what printer I suggested for people who watch my stuff who don't have resin printers, because there's kind of a feeling that these things are becoming more common. And, you know, eventually at some point they'll be the one that most people go to, as there already is. So I want to give a quick rundown of the two that I have here and the things about them that are different and the things that are the same, and then there's other stuff that's different about some upcoming printers and ones that are already out that I don't have, and I can explain that pretty quickly. So what you see in front of you on the left is the Anycubic Photon, the original version. On the right is the Elegoo Mars 2 Pro, which they sent me to review. So I've only had the Mars 2 Pro for a little while. I've had the Photon for quite a bit longer. I've done some identical prints, ran them side by side. So I'll show you what the results of that were in a bit. But so basically for resin printers, you have screen resolution is a big difference in what is out now versus what will shortly probably be the standard. So both the printers that are here are 2K resolution. So essentially the best way to think about that is these things print one layer at a time, masking UV light with pixels on a little LCD screen. So if you have 2000, 2K resolution, the amount of detail you can get is limited by that. So these are both 2K printers, which so would basically any printer that's been out for a while. So the original Mars, the original Mars Pro, the Anycubic Photon S, those are all 2K printers, so the resolution will be near as makes no difference, exactly the same. Then you also have different types of light sources. The Mars 2 Pro has a matrix, like a more even lighting, I guess, than the Photon. I haven't noticed any drastic difference between them in that regard, but it is different. The big difference is between these two, the Photon has an RGB LCD screen, whereas the Mars 2 Pro has a grayscale or monochromatic LCD screen. The huge difference between those is that a grayscale screen allows light through faster, which makes printing time faster because the UV light hardens each layer faster. So the big difference between the two printers you're looking at is the one on the right is about twice as fast, if not 3 times. You can kind of tweak those settings, but at least twice as fast. And that's the big thing. So if you don't know what to do, you're looking at printers, you need to know if it's an original kind of RGB LCD or if it's a more new mono LCD. A lot like the new Anycubic ones all have mono in the name, so you know what they are. Then the next big leap will be 4K screens in printers this size. Frozen already does one called the Frozen Sonic Mini 4K, which I asked for one of those to review, and they might send me one to temporarily do some tests on. I haven't decided if I want to deal with that. I've never reviewed something in that way before. So, but if you're thinking about spending money, the big thing I would say is, after you see the results of what I'm going to show you from the Tiger Tank parts that I printed, because I'm targeting this video specifically at 1/35 scale armor modelers, but if you just stumbled on this and you're not into that, that's fine. So is it RGB or grayscale or monochromatic? Same thing. Is it 2K or 4K? Those will be the big things that you're looking at. Like if the Mars 2 Pro here was a 4K monochromatic screen, that would pretty much be all I think I ever want. I don't have a small 4K screen yet. So the thing about it is that these build plates are all pretty much the same size. Any of the printers that have 4K resolution currently are about 2 to 3 times the build volume of these, which means you're spreading those pixels out over a larger area, meaning you still have about the same pixel density. So that's not going to get you any increased detail. Whereas if you have a 4K LCD on one of these tiny ones, it'll double the amount of detail because there'd be more pixels to be able to mask and create higher detail. So what you're looking at is the Photon is an original RGB 2K LCD, and then the Mars 2 Pro is a monochromatic 2K. So pretty much the only difference between these two is speed. Now a lot of my results resulted from also using different resins, so there's a ton of different things you're going to have to figure out. But my objective with this is I want to start selling the Tiger Tank modifications that I have digitally, not through Shapeways, so that you can buy my parts, such I mentioned in a previous video, for very little, you know, a couple dollars for like Fenders or some kind of altered piece that you can't get on a injection kit. And then you can print them yourself. So when I start uploading that stuff to a site, I'll have a, if not a printer suggestion, at least settings for different printer suggestions, resin suggestions, because what type of resin you're using, what your settings are. These will be pre-supported files, so you won't have to deal with that. But it's not perfect yet, and my adventure into this has been because that's what I see coming. I know that Panzer Concepts, who have been helping me try to learn how to support my 3D prints a little bit better, they make a lot of custom resin kits. They also are talking about this. So there's a couple different people or companies that are talking about selling things digitally to be printed, which we've all been talking about for years. So I wanted to get to the kind of heart of what people who are uninitiated to this but are scale modelers, if they're interested, what they should be looking for. That's kind of the point. So let's look at some parts, but that's the big difference. You've got, remember, RGB 2K and mono 2K. I don't have a 4K to test here yet. If I do, I will make another video. Also, the larger 4K printers like the Anycubic Mono X, I think, again, will have a similar pixel density to the original 2K screen. So that's not a big deal. What you're looking for, in theory, and I haven't tested one yet, is a small 4K mono printer. So I went with the Photon in the first place because I looked around versus, it was basically Anycubic Photon versus Elegoo Mars. This version of the Mars wasn't out yet, but it was who had the bigger user groups, like who had more of what, and the Photon seemed to be, had a heavier influence in the scene. You know, Night Shift was using it, lots of other guys I saw were using it, and I thought, well, that's the most common one, so I might as well get that. And it was $220 when I bought my original Photon, whereas now that version, this version of the Photon is $170, I think. And this version of Mars retails at $365-ish right now. So if you're comparing price between the Mars 2 Pro and the original Photon, well, it's quite different. But the Photon S, which has the exact same performance print-wise as the Photon, although it has like a better Z-axis system, that'll be more expensive, but I didn't get that because I thought all I cared about was resolution and print quality. And for me, the original Photon was the cheapest and seemed to have the largest kind of community where I could seek help if I needed it, which I eventually did for things like a lousy, noisy Z-screw, which still worked, but screeched like a demon anytime I was doing a print. So every 8 seconds it would be, you know, and then 7 seconds of silence, and then another screech. And this goes on for 13 hours in our back room. So like we're watching TV with our kids, and every 8 seconds there's a metal on metal screech. That was a problem. So, you know, I didn't know how to fix it. The Photon community, I went on there and said, hey, you know, what do you guys use? There's synthetic oils, there's synthetic other things. Grease, I think, is the other one. So stuff like that. But I'm not saying that there is no Elegoo user group or Frozen or any of these other companies, EPAX, there's lots of them. But Photon seemed like the, you know, kind of Walmart of printers at the time because it was everywhere and everyone had one. But after trying this now, I don't know if I should have made a different decision because I got lucky enough to be given a more complex version of a Mars. The original Mars would have probably have had very similar results to my original Photon. So what I want to do with the video is convey to people, should you wait for different screens? Should you wait for, you know, these evolutions, because they're not going to take long. You know, the original Mars and Photon were only a thing about it like a year and a half ago, and they're just exponentially getting different. Okay, so I have a number of parts here. Now these were all printed from the exact same 3D file with different profiles for each of these two 3D printers. The skin color, this kind of beige, this will be the Mars 2 Pro. This is Anycubic's gray, so this will be from the original Photon. I printed barrels, fenders, wheel hubs, loaders, hatches, some track links, some C-hooks, and I think that's about it. And some tool clamps, but those didn't really come out. I might show those, but essentially that's sort of a failure of the resolution of the printers currently, so I'm still working on that. Most were printed with lighter supports, so they don't have a ton to remove, but I'll show you what we're left with. I'm trying to learn how to support things less from people who are more knowledgeable than me. So worth mentioning is these two files that are the same were printed in 13 hours on the Photon and under 6 hours on the Mars 2 Pro. So that is literally half the time. Exact same file, mostly similar results, but not exactly, so I'll show you. We'll start off with my fenders because that's something people who watch my stuff should be familiar with. I broke one when moving my model around. I had them attached to the kit and it actually bumped into my original Stahlhelm and bent, and then I tried to bend it back and it broke. Not important, but alright, so right away, here you're looking at the top view of the fenders, and one thing I want to point out to you is, so this is the Mars 2 Pro, this is the Photon. Now for the sake of what you want to learn about resin printers, all you care about is that this is monochromatic and this is RGB. Because you could buy somebody else's mono. I think the Anycubic has the mono SE, which I think is a mono 2K of a similar size. So, but also the difference is the resins. This is Elegoo's water washable resin, whereas this is Anycubic's standard gray. Now this resin is thinner, so I don't know if that's what got me the increased detail or if it's the printer itself. It's really hard to tell. I'm gonna run a test on the Photon with this resin because at the angle you're looking at, you should be able to see how there are holes here up in the hinges, and unbelievably, there's a hole right there. If you see that little tab on the end of the fender, on Tiger, one of these is connected to a spring on the side of the hull plate, and this little hook hooks into that part of the fender and holds it down from bouncing around while you're driving and whatnot. So that's what that little, it's just a little metal band. It's actually tapered in the center, but that's what that is, and it's not on any Dragon kits, and it did not come out on my initial Anycubic prints, so the fact that it printed on here was mind-blowing to me. Now the holes in the hinges, that is from the way that that's designed. Basically they're just little blocks that are welded to this sheet metal, and there is a gap on the real one. And on the Photon it kind of just got muddied out. Now again, I don't know if that's caused by the resin or what. It's the same resolution of screen. So it's interesting. This one, when it was cured, has warped a little bit. Now I don't know if that's because I separated it from its supports before curing it, because it is quite thin, but you can see it's a little warpy. And most notably, you see that kind of what looks like flash on the edge there. That's unsupported layer separation, which can be fixed by more supports, but I wasn't aware of what was occurring at the time. But with the exact same file, this is the one from the Photon. You can see it is very flat and there is very little to no layer separation on that. It's a tiny little lip on the underside of these fenders. So I made these thicker in general to fit kind of with what Dragon had. You can see that little indent on the bottom there. That's to fit in with the hull plates. That's not really there on the real ones. They're all the way as thin as that indent is. But I thickened them up because you just have to for model parts. Now that detail still came out really good on the Photon, and it's harder to read on this weird resin, but it still looks pretty good on this one as well. So the main issue with this one is some of this layer. You can see that kind of stringing in the back there too. So I'm going to try to reprint this with a couple more supports to try to stop that separation. I may cure it a little more before I do all of the support separation to try to keep them straighter. But the detail with that little guy and those guys is significantly different. So that was impressive, and that's the monochromatic screen versus the RGB screen. So these are Tiger 1 barrels with the earlier muzzle brake. Overall, I'm pretty disappointed with them on both, to be honest with you, because like the locking nut for the muzzle brake and any of the detail where these different parts of the gun barrel are, just got kind of muddied. Now I had anti-aliasing on both of these, and the monochromatic one has an extra setting for blur, which I'm not real familiar with what it does. But essentially you can get rid of layer lines or stepping and harsh edges by turning on anti-aliasing, which will sort of blur the pixels, but you'll muddy everything out. It didn't really cause any problems on the fenders, but on these, the barrel or the muzzle brake detail is kind of underwhelming. And also, if you look really closely, if you look at these like straight lines on my cutting mat, that's how bendy it is. And I had the same problem with a resin Panzer Art barrel that I bought for my current project. Resin barrels just seem to bend. I didn't cure, again, I took off the supports before curing them, and maybe that would have fixed it, but that is not straight. Neither is this one. You can't really tell. A little bit closer shot of how the details came out. They look okay. There's some weird warbling in the Anycubic muzzle brake. You can see it right there. But again, like just the separation between the muzzle brake and the barrel is muddy and kind of unimpressive. But again, I could change that with some settings probably to try to get it sharper, but then it might just look a little less clean. I can do more tests on that, but essentially they printed identically, so for the purposes of this test, it doesn't really tell us a whole lot. These are the loader's hatches. Now, this is a type of loader's hatch that is not available in a 35th scale kit because it has the external locking ring. It's basically just a lock on the outside. I didn't do any alterations to these other than the original measurements of the 1:1 scale model that I built for my portfolio, and they almost fit into the Dragon kit. They're a little on the large side. There is a little bit of like flash, if you see it on the top part of this one, which didn't happen on this one. But that's a 3D printed grab handle right there. It's pretty good. And that came out perfectly. I didn't do any interior detail on this because I didn't do it on my model, so you can't see it, but they mostly came out the same, both really clean. Both grab handles look fine. But it's there's not the same issue on this side of the monoscreen one, but I'm not sure why that is. Again, is it thinner resin, faster cure times? I'm not sure what caused that, bad supporting on my part. But nothing completely discernible between these. They both turned out pretty okay. I was really impressed with the handles. So these were unexpected. Now forgive that there's still a little bit of support for this kind of U-shaped bit here. These were both just scaled down to 35th scale exactly from my original file. And they printed better than I expected, as did the guide horns. Like everything looks pretty much perfect. And they took Friol wire. Now I've since made a version of this where I capped off the external side away from the horns so you can actually pin them without having the pin come all the way through. But they fit on the Dragon sprocket as well, pretty much perfectly, which was an absolute shock to me. So nothing discernibly different between these two. They're perfect. As you can see, I pinned them together. So parts from different printers, as long as they're the same file, should be perfectly interchangeable. Really, really pleased with how that happened, and they're completely workable, just like aftermarket resin tracks, except better because I made them. It's really interesting. I didn't expect this to work very well, so that's cool. A little throwback to the last video. Here you have some Tiger Sea hooks. They both came out pretty much identically. There's really nothing to point out here. But very sharp details. I should have made one with this part turned so you could do something different with it than you could with the Dragon part, but yeah. They really don't look any different. So again, the printers pretty much perform the same and on a detail like this. You got that tiny little part up there, but they both look pretty good. All right, so now the big difference. So wheels. I, for some reason, can't find any of my wheel parts currently. So to update you with what I'm talking about, here's a completely 3D printed Tiger wheel with the inner flange on it, which is part of the test. So as you can see, Dragon does a bit of this where you get this part, but you still have to glue the outer wheel onto that. So that little connection in there, that little kind of hex thing, isn't on there, and neither is that depth. So to get this, I have made custom ones that have been available on Shapeways for a long time. So what I did was I printed the wheels with the flanges and two different versions of the flanges to see what I could get away with. The big issue is there should be holes in that flange, and as you can see on this, they came out as an indent. Now this was printed at an angle, now sort of like this on the print surface. You can see all of the support marks there. Kind of a pain. But honestly, you wouldn't see them. Not that I want to use that kind of excuses, but I'm working on how to get cleaner surfaces after supports are removed. But there should be 6 holes in this flange, and there is not on this one. This is the Mars 2 Pro. As you can see, hopefully, the holes definitely are there. Let me try to block the light a little bit. The holes are completely there, and it printed 100% correct. Both of them had a little bit of a funky spot on the bottom where it flattened in a weird way. So if that was improperly supported by me, again, I've test fitted them to the model and it looks okay. But so for this test, the mono printer, in our case the Mars 2 Pro, was able to print these little holes, whereas the Photon was not. So the other tests, this is far worse than my original test, but I printed this flat on a little raft, and that's supposed to be that same detail, and it completely smushed. Now I've printed big sets of these, which I showed in my last video, and they didn't go this bad. This one really screwed up. This was the exact same bit on the Mars 2 Pro. It printed perfectly. The holes printed on a flat surface, which I thought was impossible, and all of that lovely detail is there. So now the one of these that I lost from the set that I bought of my own from Shapeways, I have now replaced, because I was trying to print at least one good one, so I didn't have to pay $20 to buy my own Shapeways file again. So this guy printed perfectly, flat on the bed, exactly how I wanted it. So it's one reason I think these mono printers, in this case the Elegoo, will be appealing to new people, because you don't have to try as hard to get what you want. Like if I had originally had this and done my set of a thing of wheel hubs, it would have just worked. I would have been like, well, what the hell do I need Shapeways for? So that's the exact same part of the exact same file. This on the Mars 2 Pro, this on the Photon. Shocking how bad this one went, because I've never had one fail that badly. Within that same file, I printed them here. You can still see the supports. So this was flat on the ground. I printed them essentially at 45s, kind of like this. So on this one, it's not really focusing. Some of the holes are there, but it doesn't seem like all of them are. But that was on the Photon, and I almost got it to work at an angle like that. I mean, you could, in theory, could take a really small drill bit and drill those out, but again, I don't want to, since the Mars did it correctly the first time. There you can see one hole is for sure hollow. There's another one, but I don't think all 6 are there. Here's our 45-degree print on the Mars. Again, all 6 holes perfectly visible. Again, this resin is thinner, and that could be why. But so I got 2 perfect flanges off the Mars and an almost and a completely no off of the Photon. Now the only fair thing to do would be to try this different resin in the Photon and see if I get the same results. But you got to keep in mind that these layer cure times for the beige color is, I think I had it set to 3.5 seconds per layer on this one, and I think it's 8 or more on this one. So I don't know what difference it makes to have, you know, it prints upside down like this, and you're having each layer sit in liquid resin for longer. I don't know if it's accidentally kind of clogging these holes as it does that. It kind of drops down, it sits for whatever your layer cure time is. And on the Mars, it's very quick. It's a few seconds at best with a thin resin. So that's at least how I'm working it out. I don't know if that's 100% correct as to why, but since the resolution is the same, it doesn't make sense to me that the Photon can't seem to reproduce these small holes, but it doesn't seem to be able to. And as you saw on the Tiger Fenders, stuff that I didn't think was ever going to print with a hole in it came out much better on the Mars. Alright, so lastly what I'll try to show you is the tool clamp tests that I did. These are type 1. The one on the left is true 1/35 scale. It's like the mid-size type 1, and then I just scaled it up a few, 10% or whatever, and duplicated it as I went towards the right, so each one gets larger. They mostly printed okay. There you can see some of the side detail, but if you see the handles are completely flat. All of the handles completely failed in that regard. And I'm not sure why. Like, they should have 3 dimensions to them. So I'm going to continue to test these, but it kind of printed correctly. And I would like to be able to print my own tool clamps, as I am turning into someone who really likes resin printing and someone who owns all the tool clamps. I don't want to buy them from some Chinese manufacturer. I would rather do them myself because I have more reference than they do. So most of the clamp is okay, but as you can see, that handle it looks 2D. It's like it's worse than PE because it's folded, it's flat on the Z. It's not flat on, you know, the other dimensions. So not great. And I had essentially the same results with the Photon on this test. So that was about as good as I could get. I then ran another test on both printers, which completely failed apart from the track lengths. Here are a few of the Photon ones. The Mars print failed completely. What I had tried to do was use a new method of supports, which was much thinner supports, but they all failed with the thin resin. These I need to clean up, but these are the tighter ones that I don't know if it makes any sense to sell a digital file of this, but so if I can get it to focus, these have the end pins molded in there. So in theory, you know, on a larger 2K or basically a 4K printer with a similar pixel density, you could fit most of a run of Tiger tracks on there, I think. About 100 a side. On one of these larger, like, build plates, you could pretty much have them mostly vertical. I don't know who the hell wants to clean up. As you can see, these haven't really been cleaned up. I just broke the supports off roughly. Do you want to go in and clean up that many track lengths? Probably not. But they are pretty much perfect. So, I don't know. We'll see. The fact that they exist at all amuses me mostly. I have been in working with a company making some white metal tracks like Freeholes out of this 3D file. I now know that they are perfect, and that should work great, and I'll be pleased to see a metal version of this for sale because I measured my original one to make this, and it's just neato. So, but, you know, everything that I have that I want to try to sell variants of is Tiger 1 bits because I already built them. If this tends to work, we'll see where that goes. But I mostly just wanted to kind of do a primer on the printers versus each other. It is mostly a 2K RGB versus 2K mono. And then what you really want to wait for, if you feel like waiting, is the 4K mono screens. Like the Frozen Sonic Mini 4K. I assume that the Mars will have a version that is 4K soon. I also assume that the Photon will have a mono 4K at some stage as well. So you may want to wait. Otherwise, I would suggest the Mars 2 Pro out of the two that I have definitely seems to get better detail and is very fast. Remember that everything you saw here was done in 13.5 hours on the Photon and less than 6 on the Mars 2 Pro. Alright, so here we are on my desktop. So I can show you one other annoying thing. So the Photon ecosystem, as they would call it, I guess, is proprietary, whereas the Mars 2 Pro is not. So they both are basically powered by the same boards and the same components made by the same company in China. And you have to use a program to support and slice these models. So let me open it and show you. So this is G2Box, which is what I use to support stuff. Let me see if I can open one of my projects. This is the stress test that I used for both printers. Okay, we're upside down. There we go. So here you can see exactly how I did it. These supports are probably not the best way to do things, but there you can see there's the tool clamps that I was trying to do. Sorry about the camera work, but the handles should have been correct. One thing I didn't show you was this shovel. This was too thin to be printed and it just tore to shreds when I tried to remove it from the supports, so that didn't work. But there you can get a real good look at what that flange should look like. But that's not really why we're here. But this is what you need to do with files, and if I'm selling my own stuff, it'll be pre-supported like this in the best way possible, so that when you, if you were to download it and print it, all you'd have to do is throw it in whatever printer you have. So one thing to point out is if we go to settings here, we have profiles. I have a couple different Photon profiles, I think based on my layer height. So there's my 0.02 and 0.5. These are just different for that. The Mars 2 Pro profiles keep breaking, as you can see here. Here's one that did work, but that's a brand new printer, and this is the newest version of Chi2Box, so that's not really a problem that I'm concerned about. Yeah. But the thing that matters, so my files, if I sell them to people, will have all of this embedded into it. So when you slice them, this is all kind of programmed into it. So you wouldn't have to worry about that, and I would have multiple files for different types of printers, more than likely the most popular ones, and then maybe a generic-ish one. But here's the thing. If you want to slice a file, which this one is currently set to the Mars, but I'll give you an example of the problem with the Photon versus the ease of use of the Mars. Since I told you, the company that makes the software is heavily involved in the entire resin printer scene, so it's behind the scenes in the Photon to some extent as well. But so if I slice this is how it works. Hopefully that won't take too long, and if it does, I'll speed it up and you won't hear anything I'm saying. So this is how you slice something, and that's telling it what every layer is going to do. You know, so the first layer looks like these rafts, and then these layers up here more are going to look like just little supports and stuff. That's how you have to do it. Now the real rub comes after this, because this is all the same if you want to support in Chi2Box. This is what the printer is going to see on every layer, so you'll see a little you'll see the picture of this on the printer. So like each layer will do that layer, printer raises up, does the next layer, and so on. So you can see the actual mask on the right side, and you can see the layers on the other side. So if I reverse that and you're looking at this window here, this is how it will actually print, although it'll be upside down. So that's all fine and dandy. But the problem is, like, let's say that I want to use it on the Mars, which I just sliced it for because I used a Mars profile. I hit save, and it's going to save as a .ctb, which is the Chi2Box format. Now that's wonderful, but very simple. I brought it in, I supported it, I sliced it, I saved it, we're done. Now, if I wanted to do that for the Photon, and I hit slice, all right, so now we have an Anycubic sliced file. Not a whole lot of difference in what you're seeing here. It'll tell you exposure time and all that other stuff down here. Now, if I go to save this, Chi2Box, as far as I know, can still only save a .photon file. So when you pick a profile in their slicer, they have what they knew of, at least at some point, as the proprietary file extension for that printer. But if you notice, the Mars used the Chi2Box default extension. Now, here's the fun thing. Like, let's say, I'm going to do this just for the sake of this video. Let's say that I wanted to save this as a Photon file. I have now saved the .photon file. Fun fact, though, the Photon no longer accepts .photon files since they replaced components. The original Photon does, but my version, the new version of Photon, and the Photon S do not use a .photon file, so you cannot export directly from this program. They have their own proprietary program, which is, everyone would agree, not as good. So we don't even need to wait for this to write. I'll show you what the process is. So, okay, let's say that it finished writing. Then what I would have to do, I would then have to open the Photon Workshop, which is this. I then have to open the .photon file. So let's find it there. So you can also do the supports and slicing in here, but everyone agrees that this program is not nearly as powerful or as easy to use as Chi2Box is. So here it has now opened my sliced file, and I would then have to go to File, Save As, and then see how .pws, that's a Photon Workshop file, that's their new one. So I can call this stupid new file extension .pws, and now as it writes that file, now my Photon will read that file. Now this isn't the only way to do this. Technically, you can just click on the .photon file until it shows you the text, and you can just rename the file extension .pws. Certain parts about it won't work. Like you won't get a preview on the Photon's LCD screen, but in theory it does print. I've done it. I don't suggest it, but essentially all that is that they changed their file extension to PWS to be proprietary instead of .photon. Chitubox in theory could create a profile that does that, but I don't know if they're intentionally not doing it. But the reason I'm showing you this is that you have to jump through hoops just to prep a file for a Photon, whereas on a Mars you don't. And that's just an Elegoo versus Anycubic thing, not a mono or RGB or a 4K versus 2K. This is just, you know, they've created a proprietary ecosystem, which is annoying. I mean, if you want to learn how to slice in their proprietary slicer, be my guest, but why would you want to use I mean, an inferior program that is just for one company when there's a industry standard program that everyone uses, that there's many more tutorials and a lot more knowledge about. Plus, you can still use it and dump the files over into here to save them for the Photon, but it just annoyed me when I first got it. So I figured that was something worth mentioning with a Photon versus a Mars, is all this unnecessary saving and writing and all this nonsense. So now I have my .pws, which I can move on to my flash drive, whereas I had my .ctb file a long time ago, much more easily. So it's just annoying